Billions of years ago, our nearest planetary neighbor, Venus, may have had oceans and rivers, life-giving habitats like the ones that grace the early Earth. Today, its burned-out surface is a global fossil of volcanic destruction. Concealed beneath a dense, toxic atmosphere. Scientists are now unveiling daring new strategies to explore its tortured landscapes, to search for clues from a time when the planet was alive. How did Venus descend into this hellish state? And how did our planet, Earth, manage to survive? At the surface, the air is 95% carbon dioxide. So dense, it's more like an ocean than an atmosphere. And it's hot enough to melt lead. Overhead, thick clouds of sulfuric acid. No spacecraft has lasted longer than 2 hours on Venus. All we have seen close up, a few images transmitted by the Soviet Venera landers back in the 1970s. Radar images from the Magellan mission in the 90s have stoked our desire for more.
We think of it as this sort of ugly, forbidding, scary place because we've seen these few Russian lander images of these sort of eroded rocks and, crushing atmosphere. But when you look at the Magellan imagery and you see this bewildering array of volcanic forms and flows and bizarre and interesting canyons and valleys and channels that have been carved by liquid lava and volcanoes of different sizes and shapes, I think the surface of Venus is probably really beautiful.
Thousands of years ago, Asian skywatchers saw Venus as two separate stars. Qiming, the beginner of brightness in the morning, and Sangyang, the exalted western one, in the evening.
It's always sort of flirting with the edges of night. You'll never see Venus at midnight up high in the sky. It's always just in the edges of dawn and dusk.
Sumerian priests saw it as one, Inanna, goddess of sex, fertility, physical beauty, and attraction. Inanna became Aphrodite to the Greeks, born from the foam of the sea, protector of those who sail. The Hellenic goddess of love beckoned us to venture into the unknown. Roman leaders declared April the month of Venus throughout the empire. During the festival of Veneralia, Romans honored purity and piety in affairs of the heart. Across the Atlantic, Venus was seen as the little brother of the sun.
In a way, the most astute Venus observers were the Mesoamericans, the Aztecs, the Maya, the Toltecs. For those cultures, Venus was this male, macho warrior with a spear going down into the underworld and doing battle against the enemies of humanity. We think of Venus as Botticelli's Venus, the feminine figure in our culture, but it's around the world, Venus has had a lot of very different manifestations.
In time, the Venus of myth gave way to the scrutiny of science. In 1610, Galileo Galilei observed crescent Venus changing through phases, like the moon. Yet another clue that planets orbit the sun. But even through his telescope, Galileo could not discern its features. Finally, in May 1761, thanks to a rare alignment, the Russian astronomer Mikhail Lomonosov glimpsed its distinctive character.
About once every 100 years or so, Venus actually passes in between the sun and the Earth, and you can see the little dot of Venus moving across the face of the sun. At the moment when the dot of Venus starts to cross the disk of the sun, the very first moment and the very last moment when the dot of Venus moves off the disk of the sun, something weird happens. There's a distortion, what is called the black drop. It's almost like the edge of the sun kind of leaps off towards it and then is distorted inwards. And Lomonosov realized that that would make sense if Venus had an atmosphere. Once you know that, then you can deduce the diameter of Venus, and they said, oh wow, it's basically the same size as Earth. It's the size of Earth, and yet it's so bright. Why is it so bright? Oh, because it must be covered in clouds. And they were right about that as well. And the assumption at that time, which was reasonable, was that the clouds are made out of water.
The idea that Venus was like Earth sparked the imaginations of fantasy and science fiction writers.
I remember seeing a book when I was a kid that said that Venus might have prehistoric jungles and dinosaur-type animals. I thought that would be really exciting, but turned out to be nothing like that.
At the dawn of the space age, Mariner 2 was the first successful mission to another planet.
Way back in 1962, Mariner 2 became the first spacecraft to explore Venus on a flyby, and it made a fantastic discovery that the Venus surface was very hot. Unfortunately, that was not very good for Venus exploration because all the classical ideas about Venus being habitable with people and forests living on the surface just went out the door.
Stranger still, NASA's Mariner 2 found that the planet rotates very slowly and backwards compared to Earth. Americans celebrated the triumph. Not to be outdone, the Soviet Union attempted at least 16 missions to Venus between 1961 and 1984. December 1970, Venera 7 made the first successful landing and the first transmission of data from its surface. Nearly 5 years later, Venera 9 and Venera 10 captured the first images of Venus's tormented landscape. In December 1978, the American Pioneer Venus orbiter began a 13-year radar mapping mission. It was followed by a separate Pioneer multiprobe dropped into the atmosphere